Today we are talking about just understanding King 5 and more so, what is corporate governance? And joining us, we are joined by the Chief Executive Officer of the Chartered Governance Institute of Southern Africa, otherwise known as CGISA, by the CEO, Stephen Sadie. Now, you may have seen him on a couple of interviews on the news, have heard him on the radio. And of course, this is a professional body that really is dedicated to really advancing sound governance practices, ethical leadership, and of course, board effectiveness. So, Stephen, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Karen.
Thank you so much. Now, Stephen, before we get into the crux of this interview and just to help our listeners understand a little bit more of who you are and your role at CGISA.
Well, Karen, CGISA is the formal institute for corporate governance in Southern Africa. And we've been around for 115 years in South Africa. It's primarily a lot of our members are company secretaries. So let me just explain that quickly. A company secretary is a person who gives guidance to a board of directors. It's got nothing to do with a PA or anyone like that, or an ordinary secretary. So it's a company secretary that's a very senior position, and they give guidance on governance matters to a board of directors, which are responsible for the governance of a organization. So we've been around, and in order to become a member, you have to pass our exams, our board exams, just like chartered accountants. You can't just become a member. Once you pass all those exams, you can then become a chartered secretary or a chartered governance professional. It's a global institute as well. We have other countries like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Zimbabwe. So it's an international institute, and we all cover fairly similar curriculum and so on.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much for breaking that down, because I think that for many listeners out there, they hear the term company secretary, and of course they think, okay, you arranging the travel. I suppose to some extent you do arrange travel, but
not at all. We don't do that.
So that is often the perception of the role of a company secretary. So thank you for just explaining to our listeners what that actually is. But now, just to take one step back, governance, we hear this all the time. We hear about there being no governance in certain institutions, in certain municipalities. Why is it that people do not understand the term governance? And for our listeners who are probably listening and hearing this for the very first time, what exactly is governance?
Well, every company or every organization runs in a particular way, and we call that corporate governance. And it's the way that you govern your organization. Generally, you would have a leadership team, you have a management team, you have a board of directors, you would have shareholders, depending on the size of the company. So really, it's a way that a company is governed, and that will then impact on a whole range of things: your composition of your board, your sustainability as an organization, the ethics, which is a big thing in South Africa. That we have a lot of. The best way to understand corporate governance is to see where we don't have corporate governance, and we know we've had the Steinhoff debacle, we've had Tongaat Hewlett. In the old days, we had state capture and Eskom and Transnet. And so there was really terrible governance. And particularly now that we see in Johannesburg that there's no water, there's a governance issue there around the city of Joburg, around Johannesburg water, why the pipes are not maintained when we have so much rain and so on. So governance affects everybody, but it's really how a company is managed and what sort of systems it has.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now, just moving into strengthening corporate governance, and of course, the new King 5 that came into effect. Can you just explain to our listeners exactly what is King 5 and what is the purpose of these practices and recommendations?
So, so we have a code of corporate governance, as they do in other countries. You have the UK governance code, you have the Australian governance code, and so on. And it's a kind of voluntary code for how companies should be governed. Um, we had our first version of King 1 in 1994. And then about every 8 years, we did an update of that, a new version of it, because things change, there's new technology and so on. We had King 2 in about 2002, King 3 in 2009, King 4 in 2016, and now the latest version came out last year in October, King 5. So it's really a development of our corporate governance framework. And
Mm,
there's certain principles. So we're down to 13. We used to have 17 in the previous version. And those principles are important. It tells you what you should be doing in your organization. And we use the thing called apply and explain. So you apply the principle, and then you must explain how you do it or how you don't do it. So it's very similar to how they do this in other parts of the world. Other governance codes are very similar. Um, there's a board of directors in most, especially in listed companies, in big companies, in state-owned companies, and so on. And they have particular duties as a director. And there is the law, there's the Companies Act, which tells you what you have to do. But the
mm,
governance, the King Code an aspirational code. It's a voluntary code, and it tells you what is the best practice in terms of running your company and how should you do it. And there are certain principles. The first two principles are very much focused on ethics, because we know ethics is important for every organization. And Veritas, being a Catholic radio station, would know a lot about ethics and values.
mm.
And that's important, that we have ethical leadership. And that's, when you listen to the news every night and you read the newspapers, you see lots of corporate governance problems. And that's why we have a
Mm.
code of governance to assist companies, to assist organizations, even to assist municipalities on how we should be well governed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Stephen, you mentioned, I mean, earlier on, you gave us just a brief summary as to what governance really is, and we appreciate that because I think that that is probably something that many individuals think that it is just a compliance tick box exercise. King 5 also makes reference to the word conformance. It speaks about an ethical culture, performance, conformance. But what does conformance actually mean? And for, our listeners, how should they actually implement, one of these pillars being conformance?
Well, just before I answer that, so when we talk about King, we talk about four governance outcomes. It's not about the tick box where you can say we do A, B, C, D, and E. It's about the governance outcomes. And one of them is about conformance. And conformance really means, do we stick to the law, the legislation? Do we stick to our codes? Do we stick to our standards? And to make sure all that, and in particular also internal controls, your financial systems, that they're running smoothly and so on, your internal audit, your audit, and all that kind of stuff. It's all about conformance. A company has to be well run. If it's not well run, like you could see with
Mm.
the city of Johannesburg, the municipality, there's all sorts of problems with potholes and all sorts of things. But one gets a sense that the company is not conforming to its own charters, to its own laws, to its own municipality, to the MFMA, and so on. And there are three other governance outcomes, but I'll let you touch on that.
Absolutely. So, Stephen, just to move on, just to understand a little bit more now, I know that you mentioned earlier that there were the 17 principles, and I'm sure that this is a question that you get all the time. Why was it reduced from 17 principles to 13
13.
principles? Yeah.
So one of the big aims of the difference between King 4 and King 5, the King Committee tried to make it more simpler, to make it easier to understand. So, we took out a lot of repetition if there was any duplication, and tried to make it as easy to use as possible. And so we realized that we actually didn't need all the 17. Some of them were similar. And so we reduced it to 13 principles. We also want to make it easy for organizations to implement. You don't want to make it very cumbersome or complicated, particularly for smaller organizations that are not listed, that don't have all these committees and so on. And so we found that the 13 principles were sufficient. And King 5 applies to all organizations. It doesn't only apply to listed companies or unlisted companies. It applies to NGOs, it applies to universities, to municipalities, to trusts, to retirement funds, to medical schemes. And we'll talk about a little bit about that because one's got to adapt King 5 to the situation you're in. It's not a one size fits all where everyone has to do exactly the same to say they are compliant with King 5. And that's the beauty of it. You've got to adapt. It's got to make sense. And that's why we use the apply and explain regime. So if something doesn't make sense for you, so you've got to apply all the principles. You can't say, well, we don't do ethics. Well, that doesn't make sense. Well, you have to do ethics.
Yeah.
But there might be certain things you don't have this committee or that committee because you're not big enough. And that
Yeah.
may be good for a big listed company, but not for a small organization.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Stephen, because you will be unpacking that with Safisa later on in the show. So, listeners, if you've just joined in, we're in conversation with Stephen Sadie, who's the Chief Executive Officer of CGISA. And Safisa and Biz chat room would really be unpacking this discussion for you as maybe you're a small business owner, maybe you're an NPO, maybe you're a medical scheme, just how governance and King 5 would apply to those organizations. Now, Stephen, I know that there are quite a number of principles and, of course, the recommended practices. But for our listeners who are thinking, well, this is great, but how do we access this information? If this is the first time that our listeners are listening to and hearing King 5 and corporate governance, and they really want to implement ethical and effective leadership from a board perspective, and considering that it's not only value for your shareholders, but value for all your stakeholders, where can they get all this information? Do they just go into a bookstore or can they download it? How can they get their hands on King? And are there other elements to the King Code that would assist organizations to better implement governance practices and to ensure that they are practicing ethical and effective leadership as well?
Well, it's freely available. You don't have to pay for it. You just have to go on the Institute of Directors of South Africa, their website, and you'll see King 5 is quite prominent, and you can download it for free. You can read it for free, and so on. Basically, there are 4 documents when we talk about the King 5. It starts off with foundational concepts. It then goes on to the actual code where you'll find the principles and the recommended practices. It also has a glossary which defines all the key terms. And then it has something called a disclosure framework, which we didn't have in earlier versions of King. And that is, you need to disclose how you are doing these things, and you need to put it on your website so others can see. Because in the past, everyone said we're compliant with King, and then we'd open the newspapers and say, oh, there's a big corporate governance scandal. But if you look at their website, they said they apply the King 4 and King 3. So that's a new element, the disclosure framework. Why do we call it King in South Africa? People may be asking that. It's named after Mervyn King. He was the founder of the King Committee. In fact, he was asked by Nelson Mandela around about 92, 93, just before we became a democracy in 94, to head up this King Committee, which would then produce all these King reports. And so it's named after Mervyn King. He was for many years the chairman of the King Committee. And so the big thing about corporate governance, you'll certainly know when it's not there. And when you look at some of our government departments, when you look at some of our state-owned entities, our municipalities, even some of our private companies, you'll know when there's a problem, when there's no good governance. We can all understand it. And South Africans are now almost experts in poor governance. And then you see good governance every now and then, and you really get that's something we should all be aiming towards. So the document is available on the IOD website. You can just Google King 5. You'll find it very, very quickly.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And if you listeners require any additional information, please do contact us, and we'll be able to just give you that information of where you can access these documents. So, Stephen, you spoke about this disclosure templates. Just for our listeners who are probably small business owners and NPOs, how applicable is this disclosure for them as well in terms of an apply and explain? And do they also need to now make this visible on their websites?
Yes, yeah. So the King Code is there for everyone, for all sizes and all shapes of organizations. So there is a guidance note, and you'll find it also on the IOD website, which is specially done for small and medium enterprises and for non-profit organizations. And I say to you, you've got to change things a little bit. You might not have as many directors, you might not have shareholders, they're family-owned businesses, and you need to take that all into account. But this is all well laid out on the guidance notes.
Mm.
Everyone should now remember, if you're receiving funds, if you're a non-profit and you're receiving funds overseas or wherever, or a church, people want to know that you're using their money properly and you're not wasting it. Um, and so I think it should be on your website. You should tell people whether you have good governance and how you do these things.
Right.
The more transparency, the better. The same with small and medium
Mm.
enterprises. You have directors, you have shareholders. This all gets confused in small companies because sometimes the shareholder is also the director, and so on. And
Mm.
you need to be able to explain to your stakeholders, and that's your employees as well, and your communities and your suppliers, how you actually run your business. And I think it's a great thing when we can start to compare company A to company B, or non-profit A to non-profit B, and say, "Oh, I don't know whether we should be giving these people money because they don't seem to be well governed. They
Mm.
don't even they're not even using the King Code." So,
Mm.
so I think it's
Absolutely.
a useful criteria.
Absolutely. Now, Stephen, before we close off this interview, you would often see within organizations the appointment of a company secretary or having a governance professional may often be viewed as a grudge expense, as opposed to appointing an external auditor because your financials need to be audited, or you may be a small business, but you know that you need to get an accountant because you need to have your tax in order and your provisional tax payments made. Why is there this resistance towards understanding that outsourcing, or rather employing a governance professional, perhaps, is not a grudge expense, but rather sort of like a business insurance? You may not need it now, but in the future, you may see the benefits of having a governance professional or a company secretary within your organization.
When there are problems, then you turn around and look around. Why did we have all these problems? And sometimes it would be because you never had an outside person assisting you to to try and assist with some of these problems. But
Mm.
you've got to take minutes. You've got to do resolutions. You've got to maybe sometimes have an AGM. All these things need to be done properly and with good governance. And if you have a person, it doesn't have to be a full-time person. It can be outsourced, and they can assist you when you need it on a part-time basis and so on. It really makes a difference because you will run into trouble. And then, you're at the whim of a director, of the CEO, who might be a good CEO, he might not be a good CEO. And it really helps to have that outside assistance, a qualified professional who studied this stuff and who understands this stuff and is doing it in other places that can assist your organization. So there's always people don't want to pay anything, but it really is a worthwhile expense. And in these days in South Africa, we really want to show that we stand up for good governance, that we're not part of corruption or bribing and fraud and all these kind of things which are so manifest in our society. You want to actually make sure that your company doesn't appear in the newspapers, that you do not appear on TV and so on, like all the kind of things that we've been witnessing in the last few years. So poor governance has a price, and you will pay that price eventually when the risk of your governance, the reputation of your company, when it gets into the media for fraud, corruption, and so on.
No, I appreciate that, and also for really exposing the reputational risk if governance is not considered within organizations. Now, Stephen, really, this is the last question before I let you go. I wish we could go on for a while. But before I let you go, for the purposes of our listeners who are thinking now, well, I'm not a listed entity, and maybe it is a large private organization, and maybe this is an employee within an organization who's thinking, well, governance sits with the company secretary, it sits with the exco, and it sits with the board of directors. I don't have a role to play here. What role do employees play in terms of upholding governance practices?
Well, every employee should subscribe or, follow the guidelines of good governance. And if, the King Code applies to all organizations, it doesn't just apply to the CEO, to the board, it applies to everyone who works there. So you don't want your junior officials to be creating problems for the company. And so they should be asking this question, how are we applying the King Code? Where is it on our website? Why do we not discuss the King Code in our meetings and so on? This is important for all organizations. We all want to be well governed. And employees should demand this and saying, listen, we don't seem to be understanding. We don't even know that there's such a thing called a King Code or a corporate governance framework. These things are important. And you should educate yourself about it. Employees should read these documents and say, oh, I didn't realize we're supposed to be doing these kind of things. Sometimes it's common sense, but often, you need to really educate yourself. And that's why we have a qualification. And if anybody wants to join our organization, you're welcome to do our exams and to become a fully fledged member. It really is the best corporate governance qualification in Southern Africa.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who've got their pen and papers handy, could you please share the details? How can they get hold of the office if they are interested in pursuing a qualification as a company secretary or governance professional? Could you just share the details of CGISA and how they can find all this information? Because this is a really important topic, and I think that for many, it's probably the first time that they are hearing what a company secretary actually is and the role thereof. So if you don't mind, Stephen, if you could just share with us how our listeners can get hold of you and the Institute.
Well, you could just Google Chartered Governance or Chartered Secretary, or ChartGov is our website. Chartered Secretary will come up, CGISA. Google any of these terms and you'll go to our website. And there's a range of information on our website. It really is a good website. And you will see who our board is, our qualifications, our international exposure. It really is a good qualification. And we find a lot of people who already have degrees like LLBs and BComs and so on are coming to us to become specialists in corporate governance, because every organization in South Africa needs a governance specialist. It really is something that would be a real benefit to all organizations.
Well, Stephen, thank you so very much for your time. We know that you are not leaving us, so you are done with me for this moment, and you will be joined by Sifiso Ndwandwe a little bit later after the show. But I'd just like to say thank you so very much for joining me today. Thank you for positioning governance as really an important strategic driver within organizations and making it known that it's not just a tick box exercise. So we just want to say thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And we look forward to your conversation with Sifiso later on, where you will be unpacking governance for entrepreneurs. So very excited about that conversation. Listeners, do stay tuned. Shortly after this break, Sifiso Ndwandwe and Stephen Sadie, the CEO of CGISA, will be back. And in this time round, they will be unpacking why governance is so important for the early stages of a business, but also the accountability for founders and how governance can actually protect and not only your organization, but your reputation and credibility. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this very short break.
A very bright and good afternoon, listeners of Radio Veritas. Excited again to be joining you yet on another Friday afternoon and spending time learning and reflecting together. But we also in the process trying to understand very important subjects that are part of developing and strengthening our economy. And you've just listened to a great interview, very informative interview for me, and I'm sure for you, that my colleague Karen has just had with our great guest, Mr. Stephen Sadie, CEO of the Chartered Governance Institute of Southern Africa. And we have picked up that, in fact, the interview was unpacking, governance at board level and what it means for corporates, for executives, and South African leadership in the South African leadership landscape. And that is very, very important. But governance is not only a boardroom conversation. It is a founder's conversation. It is a family business conversation. It is a small business conversation. And I'm very glad that Mr. Sadie is coming back again to continue the conversation, but now help us understand how this conversation is relevant, particularly for the family business, for the small business, which are actually, in terms of numbers, are more than the large corporates in our country. And potentially, if we strengthen our small business community in this economy, we could create far more jobs than even the government and the big businesses combined could do. So it's very important that we get invested in this conversation and understand why corporate governance is important for ourselves and for our economy. Mr. Sadie, welcome back, and let us bring back this conversation of governance into the entrepreneurial space. In your conversation with Karen, you position governance as strategy rather than compliance. For listeners who may be joining us, perhaps who may not have heard the earlier conversation you had with Karen, perhaps just briefly, in simple small business terms, what is the core intention behind King 5?
The core intention is to make sure our organizations, and we talk about organizations from very, very big ones to very, very small ones, to make sure they're well governed. And generally, King talks about, we all know about the principles, but we really talk about governance outcomes. How do we know whether a particular organization is well governed or not? And King 5 has 4 governance outcomes: ethical culture, performance and value creation. Number 3 is conformance and prudent control. And number 4 is legitimacy. And if you have those 4 outcomes, we can then say, well, maybe your organization is well governed, whether it's an SME or a family-owned business or an NGO. Every organization needs to have good governance. It is not something that applies only to listed companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mr. Sadie. Entrepreneurs, as you have alluded, often believe that governance is only for large corporations. At what stage should a founder begin formatting governance structures in their businesses?
Well, as soon as possible, because when you start a company and it starts growing and you're putting a lot of hours and a lot of sacrifice and so on to get it going, but you want this thing to be sustainable. You do not want it to grow and die with the particular strong personality of the founder. There may be a second generation of family who come in to take over. There may be other individuals. And as a company gets bigger and bigger, you need to make sure your systems are well done. And if you don't have those kind of things, whether you're a small organization or a big organization, the governance issues can come in. If we look at our South African landscape, where we look at poor governance, corporate governance scandals, we look at no water in Joburg, we look at some of the issues we all know about fraud and bribery and corruption. Those are not limited to big companies. Even small companies get involved in this kind of stuff. Now, that's not good governance, and that does not help build the South African economy. And you want your employees also to buy into the company. And if you have a very domineering CEO or a domineering founder, that can tend to alienate people. You've got to put in place systems, codes, committees, and so on to help maintain good corporate governance in your entity. It's not something that only applies to
Wow.
large organizations.
Yes, yes. Interesting. But Mr. Sadie, again, that sounds very complex and very top heavy for a small business that is just starting up. Setting up the governance structures or referring to including committees. Where do I start? I don't have the resources. I don't have the networks to even identify the right people. But all these structures also cost money, and I'm hardly managing to get the business off the ground. So, what would be the most basic, principles or frameworks that perhaps as the business grows would need to be taken care of? Uh, from a practical point of view, because small businesses are stretched in terms of resources and knowledge and networks, but still they have to recognize this criticality of corporate governance. So what are the basic frameworks that a small business that is starting up and struggling with resources that they should probably consider?
Well, the King 5 code has 13 principles, and you'll find most of those principles apply to even a small starting organization, like ethical governance. Are we saying because we're a new organization, we're going to be unethical? If you have a governing body of some sort, even if it's 3 or 4 people who are on the executive team or some kind of board of directors, shareholders, you want to make sure they're doing their things properly. There's conflicts of interest. These are basic governance things. So there are 13 principles, and King's actually saying we need to apply all of those 13 principles. Under each principle, you might have about 10 or so practices. Of course, then you can start choosing and chopping and changing and apply it to your situation. The good governance is something for everyone. I mean, just to be ethical is not a choice that we should be making. If there's a risk issue for your company, there will be risks. You need to identify those risks. If there are compliance issues that you have to register with the CIPC, even though you're a small organization, means you still have to comply with basic laws, legislation in South Africa. So we do that kind of stuff, and we need to do it. There's technology coming in. How is the technology governed? So a range of these issues. There is a guidance note on the IOD website, particularly how to implement King 5 for SMEs and for non-profits. And obviously your listeners can refer to that. I have mentioned before that the whole King Code is on the IOD Institute of Directors website, and you just have to Google King 5. You'll find it very quickly. And all those principles are there to assist organizations. They're not supposed to be a burden. You need to tailor it. It's not a one size fits all. Tailor it to your organization and explain what you, particularly if you're receiving donor funds from the DTI or from donors or from whoever, people want to make sure that you're using the money wisely and judiciously.
Yes, it just summed it up quite nicely. But I wanted to say, look, from just listening to you, you're saying some of the common founder mistakes is that there's often blurred separation, and I've seen that in the small business community in particular, the blurred separation of personal and business finances, the decisions that are not well documented, and the absence of advisory structures, and those are very, very common, especially in the small business, because we think that we can do it all. We think that we know how to produce the product, but we don't perhaps look at those areas. But those areas become our hindrance to growth, in particular. And also, there is the link to fiduciary duty, the legal exposure, the director liabilities, all those issues, which I think, if complied with King 5, you begin to build at least some mitigation strategies to avoid those common structures. But you referred to the issue of funding. Perhaps could you just explain how governance influence the company's ability to attract investors or secure funding? both in terms of just building their credibility, transparency, and also assuring the potential funder that there is risk mitigation in that company.
Yeah, well, anyone who's giving money to anybody, you want to make sure that money is used for the correct purpose that you've given it. And so it's important to show your funders that you've got good governance systems, that you're transparent, that you have board meetings, that the minutes of those meetings, that your financials are produced. These are all basic things of running a company. You can't say, well, I don't have time to do this and I don't have time to do that. But you want the company to grow and to be sustainable. And as soon as you start taking shortcuts here and shortcuts there, it then really begins to create problems for the company. I would think that anyone receiving any funding from outside, whether it's from overseas or it's from the lottery or from anyone, they would like to see that your company is well governed.
Yeah.
I would not like to give money to a place where I know that money is being used for the wrong purpose.
I think this is particularly a very, very important message for small businesses in particular, because they need investors, they need institutions to fund their entrepreneurial visions, but often neglecting this exposes them then to really a big struggle in terms of attracting funding.
Even the banks, Afisa, the banks will want to know what you're doing. The banks are lending you money. That's the first place you go to lend money. And they can see that, money, there's all sorts of strange entries on your bank statements every month. Like, where's this money going? Why are you taking company money and building a swimming pool for yourself? All these kind of things. Particularly with small companies, the temptation, well, I'm the CEO. I don't have to account to anyone. I'll just use some of the company's money. I need to pay my rent. I need to pay for my children's school fees. And you don't separate the company's money from your private personal money. You're going to run into all sorts of problems.
Yes. And certainly throttling, I think, the growth potential of the business in the short and medium term. Yes, definitely. But it's often said, Mr. Sadie, that one of the attractive features of entrepreneurial startup organizations is the agility versus the very solid bureaucratic structure of a corporation. And entrepreneurs, therefore, pride themselves with being agile. How can they balance innovation and structured innovation and structured governance? Because structured governance is structured, and it often can be seen to be really curtailing the agility of the enterprise. But also, more importantly, how can corporate governance habits help the scalability of businesses, whereas instead of them remaining stagnant, how can it help to make them not only agile but scalable over time?
Look, a lot of people who started businesses may not be aware of what corporate governance is. So your first starting point is ignorance. Ignorance of the law. If you don't know what the Companies Act says, that's the first problem you got. You don't know that you have to pay tax and you have to do this and you have to register with the CIPC. But at another level, if you're unaware of what basic governance principles are, you're not going to implement them. You're not going to apply them. So I think education around what corporate governance is a very important thing. Just like you would educate yourself on the industry that you're in and try and understand the industry and so on, you need to understand corporate governance as well. Employees are involved, stakeholders are involved, suppliers are involved. They all want to know that you are doing the best thing for the long-term sustainability of the organization, even if it's a very young organization. We want to make sure we get off on the right footing, that we're setting up the right structures. And where you will notice it, where a lot of the problems start coming out, when there's employee dissatisfaction, when all sorts of things start going wrong, where people are asking for bribes and so on. Already we're on the slippery downhill slope. So the sooner that one gets on board with the whole governance issues. And it's not a long document. The code has only got 13 principles. One can read it in 1 hour. And it's important to try and understand what governance, and you will educate yourself as you go along and as you try and do things. And so, I never thought about that. I didn't think about risks for the company. I didn't understand what sustainability is. I didn't know that we're having an effect on the environment. I didn't know that, what sort of, how many committees should we have as a small organization? You don't have to have as many as they have in a big listed corporation, but you may need to have some committees, and you may need to have a board, and you may need to determine the roles of the shareholder versus the direct board versus management. These are all different issues. And if you conflate everything into one, you're going to run into a problem. And particularly, you want to make sure that the organization is sustainable, that it's around there for your employees, that there's a future for them. If people are always unsure whether you're going to get paid the next month or not, it creates a lot of uncertainty. So good structures, good principles, good decisions, good resolutions are all very important for running of any company. And that's what corporate governance frameworks are. They give you some guidance of how to govern your company, depending on the size, obviously.
Yeah. Indeed. This, Mr. Sadie, thank you. It sounds like to me, though, it's still listening to this maybe for the first time, a lot of entrepreneurs will say that sounds very, very complicated. Is there assistance out there, particularly that can assist with digesting these King 5 principles into just digestible, small chunks, implementable strategies for small businesses? Is there a resource like that, or is there people out there who are skilled in this area that can actually help an aspiring small business that says, this sounds like the route that I need to take to grow my company? I need to institute really proper governance structures, but where do I start? Is there a place where they can get assistance at a simplified level that would be just digestible for small businesses?
Yes, well, there's lots of training available. I mean, we offer training as the Chartered Governance Institute of Southern Africa. We have a website with a bunch of resources. You can go onto our website and read about different things. There are lots of people who now are training because King 5 is so new and fresh. Lots of companies are training on it. Some of the webinars are free. Others you might have to pay. But it's well worthwhile starting to train yourself on what governance is all about, particularly if you see a long-term future for your organization. We all took a while to understand what corporate governance was all about, but the sooner you get into it, the better. And it's something you keep on learning about. But I would say at the very start, just read the King Code. It's only about 10 pages. It will not take you long to read the document and just to understand the basics. And then, discuss it amongst yourself. If you have a leadership team, discuss at some of your executive meetings, your management meetings, start discussing these things and seeing how you can do some of the stuff. It's not all complicated. Some of it's actually quite basic, but it's guidance. And that's why it's not law. It's an aspirational code. It's a voluntary code. We want people to improve governance.
Yeah.
And the role of, as you say, of SMEs is big in South Africa. We only have 300 listed companies. It's not a lot. But if you look at the thousands and thousands of small, medium enterprises, small companies, those are the guys that are running our economy. And we really need to make sure that these things are sustainable.
Yeah, indeed. Mr. Sadie, if you could give entrepreneurs one governance principle to adopt this year, who are probably hearing this conversation for the first time, what would it be?
Well, my favorite is always the first two principles of King are about ethics. You really need to get on top of ethical leadership to make sure employees trust the company better. There's better trust. If they know that there's conniving or shenanigans going on at the top level with the founder of the company or so on, it does not build trust. So ethics is big. A simple thing like a conflict of interest. There might be conflicts, particularly if you've got family members in an organization. They may be conflicted on certain discussions. They may need to discuss that, to recuse themselves from a particular meeting. There's salary issues. There's so many issues around the composition of your governing body. That's important. Who's on the governing body? Why are those individuals there? How do we choose them? Do we have diversity? Do we have independence? Do we have, different skills? Do we have someone who's got some IT skills on our governing body? These are all important things. You want to bring in the right kind of expertise. You want to bring in outsourced people. You can even bring in an outsourced company secretary like Karen. She's an outsourced company secretary. These are people, we have governance professionals who trained in this to assist organizations. You don't have to employ them full time. You can bring them in maybe quarterly or when you need them, and they can assist with the minutes and some guidance and so on. Minutes are important. People can always refer to minutes in a court case later on as to why you made a particular decision. So all these things are important, but really, King wants to have 4 governance outcomes. Let's tick all these things. And ethical leadership, performance and value creation. You want the company to create value, conformance and internal controls, and lastly, legitimacy. What is your social license to operate? How does the community feel about your organization, and so on?
Wow, amazing. Thank you very much. How do people then reach, maybe you can again maybe share the website and of your organization so that they can read about these things and maybe be able to contact maybe the organization if they needed further assistance?
So we are the Chartered Governance Institute of Southern Africa. You can Google Chartered Governance. You'll find us. Our website is www.chartgov.co.za. We call ourselves Chartered Secretaries or Chartered Governance Professionals. Just Google any of those terms. You'll find us at CGISA. There are other organizations also do training. We always advise people, if you have a person, you're one of your secretaries, that you want to upskill them and train them as a company secretary. By all means, we offer an internationally accredited qualification. Instead of just having a secretary taking minutes, upskill her, let her attend some of our courses and do some of our subjects, and she can then become a qualified chartered secretary. But you can Google training on King 5. You can Google this. There are lots of organizations that provide training. Some are free webinars, some you have to pay for. And if you look on our website, you'll find lots of resources on corporate governance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sadie. Thank you for helping us unpack this very complex and yet critical subject for not just for large corporations, as per the conversation you had with Karen, but also for the large section of our economy, which is the small businesses, that corporate governance is for everyone operating in this space, and that it is protection, it is accountability, it is also a discipline that uplifts the charisma, I think, of entrepreneurs. And if entrepreneurs want to leave a legacy, especially in family-owned businesses, it is really the bedrock of building future sustainable, growth-oriented businesses that guarantee, continuous, role that they play in the economy. So thank you very much, Sadie, for making the time and talking to us. And we wish you well in the great work that you do through your organization.
Thanks very much, Safisa. It's been a pleasure to be with you.